Welcome, have a seat at my candlelight supper. Hyacinth Bouquet used to talk about those on the show Keeping Up Appearances, and she would intimidate everybody with the Royal Bolton with the little periwinkles. But the truth is, this vintage china and dinnerware was made to be used every single day. There's so much cool stuff to know about vintage dinnerware, and we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to list all these items to sell. Whether it's a single piece or a pretty table, a formal setting for special occasions, or just your everyday dishes, vintage china and dinnerware can be fun and stylish and stir memories and be part of your gatherings and something that your family will cherish and remember if you make it part of their life and not scary stuff that you put in the china cabinet and never use. It was made to be used, and with the holiday season at hand, this is a perfect time for collectors and people who just like it to add a certain piece for a serving center or get a whole set for a special occasion, or a whole set that you just use all the time because you love it. I hear a lot of people call anything breakable glass, but that is not correct. If you want to hear me talk about glass, well, that's a different video. You can check out this video I put out recently about glass that people are overlooking. What we're talking about today is not glass at all. It is porcelain, it is stoneware, or it is earthenware. And we're going to talk about all the differences. But for a real brief introduction, this beautiful RS Prussia plate, this is porcelain. RS Prussia is beautiful porcelain. It's very white, it's very thin, and it is very durable and takes decoration very well. This is stoneware. This particular piece is a utility piece from China, an old preserve jar from about the 1920s. And it is rougher and coarser, and it takes a glaze nicely, but it is not as refined and not as high quality, but still not porous like earthenware. Earthenware is like this Roseville Child's plate, and it is a little bit more porous, so it had to be sealed with a glaze. And it is a little thicker, a little heavier, and not quite as durable. But all these pieces are ceramics made of clay, and that is the thing that unifies them. They are all ceramics, not glass. So let's talk about porcelain first. Porcelain is also known as fine china, the good china. A lot of people are afraid of it these days because they were raised with parents who said, "Don't touch that, you might break it." That is just absolutely the opposite of what it was for and how it should be used, because it actually is the most durable, the hardest to break, and the stuff that can take everyday use. So if you have an old set of fine china in the family and you've been saving it for special occasions and you never use it, get it out and use it. That's what it's for. And it was made to be used every day. Now, for centuries, what most people ate off of in North America and Europe looked a lot like the items in this picture. Yes, that's right. You had to carve your own plates, your own utensils out of wood because that's what you had available. It soaked up stuff. It wasn't super sanitary. It tended to have splinters. When you carved in it, it would start to get marks on it. It didn't hold up well, and you'd have to carve yourself a new set every few years or so as things broke or wore out. It was not really ideal. But porcelain at that time was super expensive and only the rich could have it. Then the next thing they came up with was dishes made of pewter. A great idea, except that they used lead to make it. So you were getting lead poisoning every time you ate off of your dinnerware. Now we're going to talk about lead in dishes towards the end and whether you should worry about it. So stay tuned for that. Porcelain was so desirable that the secrets of how to make it and the materials that were used were carefully guarded secrets that the Chinese held for 1,000 years. It took that long for people in Europe to figure out how to make it. They guarded the clay, they guarded the formulas, and so everyone in Europe had to order their china from China, which is why it was called China. And it took 6 months to get an order delivered. If you were lucky, it might even take a year. And it was very expensive, and only the very rich could afford it. And the Chinese kept it that way as long as they could. Finally, some Jesuit missionaries among the people who were making it managed to get the secrets out of them, which was pretty amazing because to share the secrets was punishable by death in China. So it took a millennium for them to finally figure out how to make porcelain in Europe. The King of Saxony and Poland set up the first porcelain manufactory in Europe, and that was the Meissen factory. And that's why when you hear the name Meissen in China, people are very reverent of it. And their first pattern that they made was blue onion. Blue onion was so important that it is still being made 300 years later. But this was in the very early days of industrial production, and the factories could not make everything perfectly. And it was so hard to make that they didn't want to throw out the factory seconds if something had a little blip in the glaze or wasn't exactly perfect. It was so hard to make that they didn't want to throw it away. So they started selling them to the neighboring town of Dresden, and the decorators in Dresden started making pieces like this. And this is the first piece that we're putting on eBay right now. And Dresden was all about beautiful hand-painted decorations. All of this is done by hand. And the idea was that by doing these floral sprays in random places, they could cover up any flaws, make a really beautiful piece. They're typically painted inside and out. This one is from the early 20th century and has the Dresden mark. And you notice that flower that they painted, well, that is actually covering up the mark of the company that originally produced this in Meissen. So this is a very cute Dresden bowl. This particular one on a table would have been used for something like little sweetmeats or perhaps fruit, although it's a little on the small side for that. Maybe sauces like mayonnaise or even whipped cream. And yes, we are starting this at just $9.99. This is a note to you resellers. I'm putting everything out starting at $9.99, no reserve. You're going to look at some of these pieces and say, well, how can you do that? That's a $75 or $100 piece. How can you take that chance? People undervalue vintage dinnerware in China right now. And I have been salting these pieces away all year long. I did not pay more than $5 or $10 for anything that you're going to see that I'm putting on eBay right now. So resellers, take a note, because a lot of people are overlooking this category, but there are collectors. So, of course, once Germany could make their own porcelain, all of the other royal families in Europe wanted it too, and were very jealous about it. And so all the royal houses in Europe started trying to establish porcelain factories. The French started the Sèvres factory. The Russians started Lomonosov. Frederick the Great started KPM in another part of Prussia. Royal Copenhagen set out to emulate the Meissen styles. All of those companies are still around today, which shows you something about how it helps to have royalty on your side and how porcelain is considered a premium product. Now, Royal Copenhagen, of course, is best known for their Christmas plates that most people hang on the walls, but they were originally made to follow the Danish tradition of giving cookies to your friends and neighbors on Christmas Eve. But they also made beautifully hand-painted patterns in the tradition of Royal Vienna and some of the other Austrian and German companies. And this is that pattern, Saxon Flowers. Saxon Flowers, a very popular pattern. They also are very well known for their seagull pattern, which 1 in 10 Danish homes have to this day. This is a turkey platter. Turkey platters are much more desirable than the smaller platters. Not very many people spent the money on the big turkey platter. And this is definitely the time of year people look for these. There's the Royal Copenhagen mark. Again, we're going to put this piece on eBay right now for $9.99. And see where it goes, but these usually sell for somewhere in the $75 to $100 range. Now, porcelain is different from stoneware and earthenware in that it uses kaolin clay, fired because of the ingredients at a much higher temperature than the other two. It's fired at about 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is the reason that it bakes so thin and so crisp and is very strong and durable. That is why porcelain has traditionally been the most desired of the three ceramics. It's also why it can take going from hot to cold the best. And so you can take the turkey out of the oven, set it right on that plate, take it to the table, and then put the leftovers with wrap in the refrigerator directly, and it can handle it because it is made to last. Now, you notice I didn't mention any of the English companies. England is where the dinnerware factories flourished the most. But when Wedgwood started in 1759, they only knew how to make stoneware. It took them a long time to be able to make porcelain. It Took a long time in general for the English companies to figure it out, but Wedgwood did eventually make porcelains, particularly in the 20th century, like this piece. This is wild strawberry, and it's a very cute pattern. It has the formality of shape of a coffee pot that we see in the 1920s era, but the fun and sort of more rustic style of decoration that we would see typically in the 1960s and 70s, when people still wanted nice things, but they wanted a little more casual way of living. The reason this is a coffee pot is because the spout starts low. Teapots have a spout that starts high. Coffee pots start low. So that's how you know the difference. And it does have the Wedgwood bone china mark. We'll talk a little bit about what bone china means in a few minutes here. Now, I'm always very careful to make sure that there are no chips or damage, because sometimes people would drop lids and there might be chips under the lid. This is in perfect shape. This is going on eBay right now. Now, stoneware like Wedgwood originally made is thicker and heavier, and it's well made. It's fired at about 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not have the same elements in the clay. The clay is usually brown or red, and so you will see that underneath where it's not glazed. And it is thicker and heavier and a little coarser than porcelain. And it cooks very hard in the kiln, because what they do with stoneware is, instead of using the oxygen to react with everything, they actually take the oxygen out of the kiln. It's what they call reduction. They reduce the level of oxygen, and so the clay cooks very thickly and heavily together. And so that density makes stoneware a nice quality product. But it has to be glazed, or else you just have raw stoneware like you see a lot of studio stoneware. This one is Denby's Pink Gypsy. This is another English company, and this particular line was made in the 1970s. When we talk about lead in dinnerware, 1971 is the magic year. The major companies in Europe and the United States reduced the lead to a point where it was practically non-existent. So this is a casserole dish, and it does have a vent hole in the top. So this was actually made to cook in and then take right out of the oven and put on the table. The Pink Gypsy, this is a very popular pattern with modernists. Denby in general is the company that a lot of modernists look for, and we're going to put this on eBay right now too. So both porcelain and stoneware are great to take from oven to table to fridge, because they can take the thermal shock. However, if you're collecting and using your old teapots and coffee pots, for example, it's still a good idea to warm things up slowly. So, for example, you can put the hot tap water in your coffee pot or teapot, then pour the water into whatever you're brewing the coffee in, and then put the hot coffee into this. That way you're not shocking the piece. And if you have a nice collectible you paid some money for, it's just nice to baby it a little bit. You don't have to. They are made to just have it put directly in, but I usually do just as a precaution. Eventually, the English did come up with ways to make porcelain. Part of the problem in England was they didn't have all of the clays they needed to make porcelain, so they developed what's called bone china. And that's the name that Spode gave to its china in 1796, because they added powdered cattle bones to the clay mix. Nowadays, they use a synthetic, so you don't have to worry about there actually being horse bones in your porcelain if it's English. But when it says bone china, that's the formula. But what was great about bone china is it was lighter, a little less dense, and really very creamy and white. Now, Spode was very significant. He worked with a merchant by the name of Copeland, and they opened one of the first china shops in London and became super popular with the rising merchant class. So unlike the other porcelain houses in Europe, they were catering to people like us as opposed to just strictly the royalty. And some of their patterns have been made for 200 years now. They figured out how to make transferware, and that was important too, because that saved the cost of hand painting. Transferware is where you use a decal and you put it under the clear glaze, and then the clear glaze goes over it and sets the decal, and that's your pattern, instead of having to hand paint every single piece and then put the glaze over the painting. Or painting on top, which is what they call overglaze. Painting on top is actually a source of lead, and that is something you have to watch for. So with true antique dishes, If you are looking at something where the painting is on top of the glaze, you definitely don't want to use those for food. Now, sometimes the transfer would run, and that's where the term flow blue comes from, because a lot of the original patterns were blue and then sort of a sepia, and then they started in browns and reds and other things. But the blue was the most popular at first. And if the decal wasn't really fixed right, sometimes the heat of the glaze would melt it a little bit and it would run. Those were considered factory seconds by the English, and they didn't like them. They still don't collect flow blue to this day. They send it all to North America. So Canadians and people in the United States ended up with flow blue. And there are a lot of collectors of flow blue here because this is where it all went. Now, the Staffordshire potteries were really influential during the Revolutionary War. They were anti-war because they needed a place to send their factory seconds, and the war they feared would cut us off from them and that we would go to the French or start making our own. When the war was over, we embraced their products and kept buying them because they had supported us. Now, because Spode could make lots of designs with decals, their trick was to make interesting blanks and then apply the decals to them. Now, what is a blank? Look at the pattern around the edge of this and imagine that there isn't that floral spray in the middle. That is the blank. All forms of dinnerware are done on some sort of a blank. It might be simple and round and plain. It might be ornate and fancy like this. But they all have some sort of a blank, and then they decorate on top of that blank. This particular blank was called Jewel by Spode, and that's why you see Spode's Jewel on this mark. This red mark is from the first half of the 20th century. Then you see a second name, Spode's Claudia. Claudia is the name of this pattern with this floral spray. And this came out in 1930, so you see it's decorated on the sides as well. You have decoration on this side and then decoration inside. But the idea was that we would make attractive blanks, and that would be something we could do all sorts of different patterns on to the taste of the individual buyer. This particular blank, the most famous pattern that they made on it was Billingsley Rose, but the Claudia is very pretty, and this piece is going on eBay right now as well. This, by the way, is called a vegetable bowl when it's an oval like this, as opposed to, we'll see later, some salad bowls and some trophy bowls and those sorts. And of course, tons of other English firms followed. Minton, very, very famous. Shelley China, Royal Albert, Royal Dalton. Royal Dalton has basically absorbed most of the other companies at this point. There also was the Peregrine Company and the firm that made this sandwich tray. This one is the Foley China Company. Sandwich trays may be square or may be round, but they always have two little tab handles. And the idea was that you would make pedophores or little sandwiches that you would cut up into pieces and serve them on these trays at lunch or during cards or bridge or that sort of thing. And there is the Foley back stamp. Foley is another of the very collectible companies from Europe. I'm showing this piece because this is one of two colors that they did in this pattern, and they referred to this as the Christmas pattern. And since we're coming up on the holidays, I figure somebody who is an Anglophile and likes the notion of this being something that would have been used in England during Christmas might enjoy this piece. And it's going on eBay right now as well. Another very famous company that we only recently lost in England that was a porcelain maker was this company, Royal Worcester. And this pattern is called Evesham. And if it sort of reminds you of Portmeirion, well, Portmeirion basically borrowed this concept in decorating. Portmeirion does not have a gold rim, which means it's appropriate for the microwave. Evesham came out in 1961, and so the original Evesham like this, it is made to use in the oven. It isn't really made to use in the microwave, but if it says Evesham Vale, they figured out in the 1980s how to put a gold trim on that is microwave safe. You can certainly look online and find out before you start collecting if a pattern that you like is microwave safe, because Royal Worcester and a few of the companies did figure out how to do gold trim that could be put in the microwave. But for the most part, the gold or the platinum trim actually have metal in them, and so you wouldn't use them in a microwave. Interestingly enough, in the old days, you paid extra for gold and platinum trim, and nowadays, a lot of people don't want the gold and platinum trim because of how they're using their dishware. This piece is an oval casserole as opposed to the round one we saw from Denby, and this is porcelain. And they even have a shape on here because they did different shapes and different sizes. And one thing we see with pattern matching, and here's another note for you resellers, a lot of these companies went away in the early 2000s or during the 2008 financial crisis. And there are people who were starting collections who are still looking for some of the serving pieces to finish their collections. And that's where a lot of the collector market is. And you'll notice that the things that I'm showing you are all serving pieces. I definitely look for those pieces because, they typically sold a service of 6 or 8 or 12. So there's 12 bread plates and 12 cups and saucers and 12 dinner plates for every one casserole dish. So the serving pieces are the harder pieces to find. So like I say, a lot of these Staffordshire firms did disappear or consolidated over the past 20 years. But at one time, there were as many in Staffordshire in England as there were in the Limoges region of France. And a lot of us have heard of Limoges, China, especially popular during the 1910s for producing lots of patterns with small floral garlands. But there was a company in New York called Haviland, and Haviland went further because Haviland was exporting to the United States and they wanted to bring things in for American tastes. And they knew that Americans by the 1920s were looking for things that were a little more modern and a little more elaborate. And that's why they made pieces like this. This is also a vegetable bowl. Vegetable bowls are fun because they can be all sorts of different shapes. This one happens to be a hexagon with open handles and gilding. Now, this would be a pretty piece to just have on a table, and there are lots of people who mix and match now. Thanks to Martha Stewart, we've all been given permission. You don't have to have just one set of dinnerware or only use one thing in the house. You can have anything you want. And so this would be a very pretty piece to just use on a side table for various things, even if you are not collecting an entire pattern of this. This is Limoges, and this particular pattern, you see the Theodore Haviland mark. In fact, you see a couple of marks. This particular pattern is called Chaladin, and it's decorated on the outside as well. And this is very much a 1920s style where they have a band of decoration at the top in a color that is different than the white porcelain base. So I just think that's a very attractive piece, and it's the sort of thing that you don't have to have an entire set to think is interesting. This one's going on eBay right now as well. Another thing that Haviland had commissioned that was a modern take on an old style is this meat serving tray. This is a medium-sized platter, so this would be for maybe a roast or a nice piece of fish or something like that, as opposed to the big turkey platter we showed you before. But look at the modernization of the well for the juice. In the old days, they used something that looked like a tree of life, or they would do something else that was a big spine down the middle. It was very popular between the First and Second World War to have things decorated with exotic birds in sort of an vaguely Asian design. Way back when, all the patterns came from China, and that's why you see a lot of Asian-looking designs in Western-made China, because that was the tradition. This piece is from sometime around 1940, and this one is Ambazar, and there's the Theodore Haviland Limoges mark. Now, this is what they call a dry foot, and the dry foot means that they could make this on the kiln and the glaze wouldn't stick to the kiln. That's why you don't see glaze on these parts, because they had to be able to lift it off. Otherwise, the glaze would stick to the kiln and then they'd have to scrape it off. And you will sometimes see where something overspilled and they had to scrape it. And you'll see scrape marks on the bottom of the piece. We're going to list this one right now as well. Now, of course, the Chinese originated porcelain, the Japanese made porcelain, but until about 1900, everything they made was really tailored to an Asian design, and people in Europe and North America would buy those designs because That was what was available, and that was the tradition. But just as Haviland imported through New York, there was another company, the Morimura brothers, who started importing from Japan around 1905 for Western taste. And that is where Noritake China came from. You'll also see Morimura brothers pieces that have an M in a wreath, and those were also made by Noritake. Noritake had two different factories, and they made red mark and green mark. The red mark was the higher end stuff, but they did some other special marks like this one in gold. And that was typically for gold decorated items like this. This is a bonbon server, could also be used for asparagus. That's why you have this interesting shape with the handles. Again, this could be a very pretty piece to just have on a table for occasional use, or it can be something that you could put out as part of your dinnerware. I love the colors on this one. We don't see a lot that have lavender. I just think this one's a real beauty. It just really appealed to me personally. I love the way the hands come up. These interestingly shaped hands, again, this is a style we see starting around the 1920s, and it carries through for probably about another 30 years or so after that. All of the gold is hand painted, and you see some hand painting inside the flowers, but the outline is in black, and that is done with a transfer. So that's another way that things could be decorated, where you have a transfer decal, but there's hand painting within the transfer decal that just gave them a pattern to follow. So this has both transfer and hand painting on it. By the 1970s, Noritake was one of the leading sellers of porcelain, particularly on the West Coast. We see a lot of it out here. This is a nice example of how China can grace a table without you necessarily committing to having a table full of it. So we're going to list that one on eBay now, along with this. And this is interesting. This is an example of things coming full circle. This is also made in Japan, made in a style that is typical of Meissen, a variation of the blue onion pattern that we talked about that started 300 years ago. And this particular one is a pattern called Vienna Woods. Vienna Woods fine china, also Blue Danube, made in the 1970s, 80s, 90s era in Japan, definitely made for a Western taste. And this little double sauce boat with the dolphins on it is going to list right now as well. So somehow we've gone all the way around the world without talking about things made in North America. And there's a reason for that. Because every time we'd start a porcelain company, the French and English would dump their stuff on the market, put us out of business, and then own the market again. And that went on all through the 19th century. And finally, we got fed up with it. And porcelain and pottery had a lot to do with the establishment of the Sherman Antitrust Act. That industry got really up in arms and finally got our politicians to do something about it. So you had to put the country of origin on your wares so that you couldn't just dump it, pretend it was made in the US, and put us out of business. And because of that, various companies in the 20th century in the United States made fine china, Castleton and Syracuse, but the buff-colored wares of Lenox China made the biggest impact on the world market. And the reason for that is one of them survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and that piece was sent to Tiffany's and put in their display window. And people were so impressed that it was such good quality that it could survive that horrible conflagration that all of a sudden Lenox was the thing that people wanted in fine American homes. By 1917, they were commissioned by the White House to make a 1,700-piece china set for the cost of $11,000. They are the only American porcelain producer to have been shown in the Sèvres Museum in France. Lenox has made over 1,000 different patterns. The wheat pattern is one of the best known, but they also made patterns like this. This is Castle Garden, a very pretty, rather ornate pattern. And this is another style of vegetable bowl, but it's almost the shape of a relish dish. It's a little wider than a relish dish, but it's got this interesting scoop design, all sorts of styles, all sorts of colors to fit all sorts of tastes. There's the Lenox Castle Garden mark. Now, if a Lenox piece is decorated in gold, it is going to have a gold mark. If it was made after 1952, it's also going to have a gold mark. If it was made before then, it will have a blue mark. So we're going to put this one on eBay now. They also sold blanks. We know what a blank is now. And they sold them to various decorating companies like the Picard China Company. Picard out of Chicago decorated this piece, again in the style of the Austrian potteries and Dresden, with lots of small floral sprays, put their name on the pieces that they did. And this is their floral chintz pattern. And this, of course, is a gravy boat. There's two types of gravy boats. There's this, which is called a fast stand, where they are fastened together. And then there's other ones where they are separated. And what that is called is a gravy boat and then a liner. The liner is the bottom. With the cup, it's a saucer. With everything else like sauce bowls and gravy boats, the liner is the base that is separate from the piece. But this is a fast stand because there it is. So we're going to put that online. Picard, in the early days, they had a lot of artist-made pieces, and some of those are very, very valuable. And then this piece is Lenox, and this is a wonderful trophy bowl. It'd be great for fruit or a big stew or soup. And this is the Mystic pattern. So you can see how the color patterns really change with the time. Mystic is something that was very popular in the 1980s. And I've noticed that we're seeing a lot of interest in pastels again. So this seems like a very timely moment to have this piece. And notice again, it has this interesting different band, which was something very popular in 1920s China, because of course the 1980s was a Deco revival era. So you have this 1920s shape with a 1980s design on it. So this is Lenox Mystic. Now, Lenox in the 60s and 70s and early 80s did black mark for a while on their better pieces. So those are examples of porcelain and stoneware. But what about the classic American dinnerware that we know and love, that a lot of us grew up with? Most of it is not porcelain. Most of it is not stoneware. It's earthenware. Well, this is already listed on eBay and not for $9.99, but this is pre-Columbian art, and this is clay, and this is earthenware, where they basically took, in those days, they took clay and they made these pieces, they decorated them, and then they would dry them in the sun. Well, of course, later on, we have industrialization and we have kilns, but it's the same basic concept where you take clay and you cook it in a kiln into a shape and you make earth into earthenware, and that's why it's called that. Well, earthenware is great stuff, but it's porous, whereas stoneware and porcelain cook at hotter temperatures and the porosity goes away, so it can hold water and fluids and doesn't leak. Earthenware will leak if you don't put a glaze over it. And that's why it's not as strong or as durable. It's also not as expensive to make as porcelain and stoneware. But earthenware is also really fun, often really colorful, and much more known to a lot of people because in the 1920s, when people started wanting a more casual lifestyle, the California pottery companies started making things out of earthenware that were fun and colorful. And then the Depression came, and a lot of Americans could not afford porcelain anymore. And so there was a demand for a more casual style, and 5 major pottery companies started producing in California: Bauer, Pacific, Vernon, Metlocks, and Franciscan. Bauer kicked it off with the success of the ring pattern and all sorts of bright colors like oranges and reds. It was simple. It was a solid color. It was very modern. It was something that flappers and young people thought was really something very different than what their parents and grandparents had. And it really did well at a time that the economy wasn't doing well. Those companies were flourishing. So Metlocks got into the act right down the road. And one of the first things they made were these. These are the Line 300 tumblers. Again, very simple styles. And these are in very happy pastel colors. And Metlocks also used a brand called Poppy Trail, but this is one of their first lines. And so they don't even have the Poppy Trail mark on them. And they're just so much fun. They're great colors. We consider these juice glasses now, but back then juice was hand squeezed and a juice glass would have been half the size of this. So originally they were probably made for water. These days we would use them maybe for water, maybe for juice. We're going to put this out as a set for $9.99. These usually sell for about that each, so I think somebody might get a great deal. But California, of course, wasn't the only place that made dinnerware. There was the huge Homer Laughlin company in Ohio and a lot of other companies on the Ohio River. And Homer Laughlin realized that they were losing ground quickly in the Depression because of the success of the California potteries. So they hired Frederick Reed away from Roseville Pottery, where he had designed their very successful flower lines that were keeping them going in the Depression. He designed a ringed pattern to compete with Bauer, and it was called Fiesta. And this is the Fiestaware Relish set, one of the better, bigger sets in the line. And there is the Fiesta mark. And Fiesta originally came in 6 original colors, a very red orange, which used uranium, and they had to discontinue that in 1941 because the uranium had to be put aside for war uses. They did this happy yellow, ivory, they did a cobalt blue, and they did green and a light blue as well. That's almost a turquoise color. Now, the original relish set had these inserts, and they said Fiesta like this. When they started remaking Fiesta in the 1980s, they took all the lead out of the glaze. So newer Fiesta is absolutely lead-free and says so right on it. And they restyled these with a little concentric ring in the middle, and that is called the Omni pattern. Unfortunately, this wonderful relish set, which I got a great deal on at an estate sale, is missing 2 of the inserts. Here is a reseller note for you if you're a reseller watching this. I am going to sell these 4 pieces individually because when these are selling on eBay, they're selling for about $35 each. The whole set sells for about $225 in these colors. So the bottom tray should sell for around 100 potentially. The center insert for about 15 and about 35 each on these. So I'm going to get close to the full value of the set, even though I'm missing 2 pieces. And unfortunately, I just have not been able to find 2 that were affordable to complete the set. So we're going to sell it individually and let it be a donor for people who have other pieces that have become chipped or cracked or lost. And they will be able to make a nice set, or maybe someone will buy all these pieces and then buy the other 2 pieces to go with. But the biggest of the California pottery makers was a company called Gladding McBean, and they started out with the El Patio line, very similar to Metlock's Line 300 or the plain Bauer pieces that were just solid colors, and it did pretty well. And then they started a swirled edge called Coronado, and it did pretty well. And then they decided to do something that was mainly done by porcelain makers. They were going to hand paint pieces, and they came out with this pattern around 1941. Desert Rose. They used the glazes they were using on their solid color stuff. They hired decorators, mostly women, and they made these embossed patterns where the leaves and the flowers are in a texture, and then they painted the finials, the leaves, and the stems all around. And Desert Rose took off and was a giant success. This is the most popular dinnerware line in the history of dinnerware making. They made 60 million pieces of it in the first quarter century that it was out. Eventually, the company sold out to an English company. They moved everything to England, so you'll see pieces made in England after the 1970s. You'll see pieces made in Portugal and other places as well. Honestly, the quality of the American-made stuff is better, and that's why the collectors keep coming back to it. Franciscan went through a number of different logos over time. Franciscan was the brand name they adopted. This is what they call the TV logo because it looks like the shape of an old television set. They were actually the first company to realize people were not eating at the dinner table anymore, and in the mid-50s, they started making what they sold as TV trays. Desert Rose is a beautiful pattern. When I first started in the business, I got a huge set of it and I sold all of it. And that is what established me as an antique and vintage dealer. Still very popular. There is a lot of it around. So it's important to look for pieces in perfect condition. And this butter dish is in great shape. One of the reasons I like to buy butter dishes is ceramic butter dishes, you leave butter in it, eventually they get stains and then people need to replace them. So there always seems to be a replacement market for the butter dishes. And we're going to put this one on for $9.99. They typically sell around $25 plus shipping. Now, as popular as that was, by the 1950s, Franciscan also realized that mid century modernism was in full swing, especially in California and the urban markets. And 1955, they came out with Starburst, and it is so cool and so fun and so collectible now. It's very atomic era transfer patterns with these wonderful shapes that are radically different than the traditional shapes other firms were making. It is such a popular pattern. I met a woman who collected it, and she rolled up her sleeve and said, "Look," and she had a tattoo of the Starburst pattern around her arm. So there are people who are really into Starburst. But Starburst was such a success that they took the blanks, again, these new interesting shapes, and they quickly followed up with a number of other patterns and colorations on the same blanks, including these that we're going to list on eBay right now. This pattern is Ferndale, and they got cute little ferns on them, and it's a salt and pepper shaker. And I find that salt and pepper shaker collectors like these as well. And I often look for things as a reseller that I figure have more than one collector. A lot of people eat on the go now, or they just want snacks that they can have near them at the television set. And so relish dishes, and in this case, this was the child's dish, also in Ferndale. These are collectible because you can put some olives, some nuts, maybe some little gelled candies or fruit, and have it next to you as a snack. This was the child's dish officially because you know how children, I was this way too. I don't want my meat touching my potatoes, and I especially don't want the gravy or the sauce getting into the other food. So they made these for kids, but most people use them as relish dishes now. Originally, this piece in the autumn pattern was the relish dish. So you notice the difference in shape. Also in the autumn, they made this picture, and you see the lines that give the implication that the leaves are blowing through the wind. That's very clever, a very 50s modern shape. These were in production in the 50s and 60s. This one is the large water pitcher. This would hold a gallon, as opposed to this piece, which would have been a milk pitcher. It's a little bit smaller. They also did quart sizes. This pattern is called Trio, and you definitely get the modernist feel of this design. So casual, fun, and something people could use every day, and a lot of people still do. These are going on eBay as well. Of course, other companies quickly followed, and there's tons of different patterns way beyond the scope of what we can talk about here. But one company that did really good modernist design and caught on to it about the same time was Red Wing in Minnesota. They hired a gentleman who had worked for Vernon Kilns, Charles Murphy. And Charles Murphy was a great designer. He did a lot of square dishes that were hand-painted patterns for Red Wing in the 1940s. And by the 50s, they came out with this. This is Smart Set. And this is a really fun modernist pattern, modified rhombus shapes. Metlocks came out with Mobile in various designs. They're just really fun. This is a large, large bowl, and this is the salad bowl, although a lot of people buy something like this and use it for popcorn as well. Smart Set is a really fun design, and when you see the other pieces in the design, some of them are just radically modern for their time. That's going on eBay now as well. So there's just so many interesting choices if you collect dinnerware, and there's tons of good old reference books that cover all these different companies, and you can flip through, or you can do searches on eBay and just put in vintage dinnerware and find patterns you like. And right now, the prices are really great. The prices for most of those, except some of the modernist patterns, have gone down. And why is that? Well, my generation was not interested in pattern matching. My generation was happy to eat on paper or plastic. I didn't ever feel that way because, first of all, paper plates, they use dioxin to bleach the paper. That's not a great chemical to be having near your food. There's microplastics. Plus, that stuff all goes in the waste stream. So I never really understood that idea. But when you get older and you spend more time at home, or if you're in the newer generation, which is also spending more time at home because houses are really expensive. So if you get one, you want to spend a lot of time there and enjoy it. People are starting to say, hey, I'm nesting more. Why not have something fun on the table that I can really enjoy and that's fun to look at when it's sitting in the cupboard? A lot of people who collect this sort of stuff have glass front cupboards to display their favorite serving pieces, and it's actually part of their decor. But the big question for a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people, is how safe is it to use old dinnerware? And what do I need to know? Well, we talked about being careful about metal rims. Most of them are not made for the microwave. If you're going to cook in the microwave, you might need to find a pattern that doesn't have them. Cooking in the microwave is something that you can check if you have an old pattern. When I bought the stone china from Harkerware, the first thing I did was I went to Goodwill, I found a saucer, I put a piece of cheese on it and put it in the microwave for 5 minutes to see what would happen to it. If you want to make sure that your vintage dinnerware is safe to use in the microwave, you don't have to do the cheese trick that I do. You can put a glass of hot water in the microwave so that you have something that's heating next to the plate. You put the plate not touching the glass next to it. And when the microwave is done, if you take the plate out and it doesn't feel hot, then you're fine. If it feels hot, it's probably not a good thing to use in the microwave. But the big bogeyman in the room where dinnerware is concerned is lead. I get an email or message a couple of times a week from somebody saying, I'm really concerned about using my stuff because I hear it has lead in it. Well, let's talk honestly about that. Get beyond the social media and AI hype. If you look up in AI, it says, yes, old dinnerware has lead in it. And if you use anything before 1971, you have to be really careful because you might poison yourself. So here's the reality. There is lead in older glazes in dinnerware. The EPA didn't require lead to be taken out until 1971. There are also trace amounts of lead in clay because it's just a natural ingredient, a mineral that appears in clay deposits. So if you test something with a lead tester, which you can get at a hardware store, it may test for lead even if the amounts are extremely low. The things I would be personally concerned about would be studio stoneware, because studio stoneware is not necessarily tested and kept up with in the same way that a commercially manufactured product, where there are people going in and testing these things and government controls, would take care of for you. Now, if you're looking at antique dishes before about 1920, a lot of those have lead in the glaze. They may have lead in the paint. If the paint was applied over the glaze, then absolutely you do not want to expose food to it or yourself to it through eating off of it. If it's made after that time by a major factory, it is vitreous. Major factory production was very good at covering all of the piece with the glaze. For example, this Franciscan piece, even the bottom is glazed. There is no part of this that is exposed that is going to get into food. Now, the glaze itself before 1971 probably does have some lead in it. It's generally trace amounts. The main ingredient in the glazes is silica because it's like a glass. And so there is some lead content, particularly in brighter colors like red and yellow and orange, because they used lead in the decoration. But again, it's sealed. So if it's well sealed and there's no chips and no cracks, the likelihood is you're not going to have any problem with it. If there are chips and cracks in the piece, the best thing to do is to throw it in the garbage. Or if you look across the surface and it is heavily worn into the glaze, then you should be concerned about the possibility that you're exposing yourself to lead. This is a Glidden stoneware piece. Now this has crazing. Look how it has a lot of little cracks. Some people think that's very sweet and rustic looking. Some people don't like that. Crazing is what happens when the glaze and the ceramic underneath cools at a different rate. And it eventually will show up as little cracks in the glaze, but it is the back of the glaze between the ceramic body and the glaze that's cracking. It is not on the surface. So again, not something you have to worry about for safety, but if it has a hairline crack or a chip in it, the best thing to do is throw it in the garbage. The other thing about lead is, for the most part, if you're not storing acidic things, like for example, orange juice in a pitcher, it's not going to leach lead. But if you leave acidic things in something that is not well glazed, that can leach things into your drink. Bear in mind. What am I using this for? How long am I using it? If I'm using this plate to serve a meal on and it doesn't have any damage and it was properly made at a good factory, I'm not worried about it. If it's some sort of a handmade studio piece and I'm not really sure of the origin and I'm not sure how they glazed it, and I'm storing salsa in it, for example, that might be a problem. So it's really just a matter of using common sense. So that is the reality of lead. Don't let the social media hype fool you. Consider how you're actually using the pieces, the condition of the pieces, and who made them and how. And then you can decide whether these things are appropriate for you. There's wonderful patterns that are pretty and meaningful and that you can incorporate in your life, whether it's one piece or a whole table full, to enjoy every day. Well, I hope you enjoyed my candlelight supper. I'm not a cook, so there was no food, but the tableware was great, don't you think? I really enjoyed this stuff, and it's so much fun to collect and so much fun to use that I wanted to share it with you. You can go to the links in the description and look up all of these pieces on eBay. They will be for sale and auctions just in time to get for Thanksgiving, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and Hanukkah. And I hope you remember this stuff was made to be used. Just remember our tips, make sure it's in good condition, and a lot of it is easy to clean and easy to take care of, and you can have fun with it all the time. If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help, and we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.